All right, so welcome back, everybody, for part two of this lecture on Unit 1, Peopling the Planet. So, in the first part of this lecture, we took a quick look at how is it that our species is able to not only migrate into essentially every habitat on Earth, but then once we enter those areas, establish ourselves as essentially the dominant species. So now what we're going to take a look at in part two is once we are established worldwide, what does early human life look like? And in terms of human history, I mean, this is a pretty important question because these early Paleolithic humans, and by Paleolithic, we mean pre agriculture, they make up 90% or 96% actually of our entire human history. So that begs the question, well, what were we doing for 96% of our history? So some of these social norms that we see developing in these early Paleolithic humans, you have a hunter gatherer lifestyle, right? It is highly nomadic, meaning that we're following seasonal food sources, wild grains, wild grasses, wild berries and fruits, migrating animals. You also see that because of this lifestyle, all right, pre agriculture, we cannot support large scale groups of people. So early Paleolithic human social groups are usually going to be based on blood relations, on kinship, extended family, and you're generally looking at groups of no more than 15 to 25 people. Um, so now this may seem like a very difficult life and a very tough existence, but there are parts of this way of life that are, you know, almost better than what we enjoy in modern times. In this early lifestyle, you have a much more egalitarian society. The workload is shared much more equally between men and women. In fact, women are probably more revered than men. This has to do with several things. Number one, their importance in birth and child raising. Um, if you don't produce new humans, if you don't produce babies, then your kinship group is not going to last very long. Women's status is also elevated by the fact that they are the main food producers, they are the breadwinners. Men tended to be the hunters, and they were gone for extended periods of time, days, even weeks on end. So the majority of the food was produced by women gathering locally within a much smaller radius of the settlement. Another way in which this is more egalitarian is when you look at the nomadic lifestyle and you pair that with our inability to support large groups of people. This means that early Paleolithic humans have a lot of difficulty in storing goods and transporting surplus, which means that there is very little accumulation of wealth. The majority of time is spent in search of food. If there is any surplus, it's usually consumed before these groups move on into a new area because it simply is not worth the energy to transport large amounts of surplus goods. So, with no accumulation of wealth, what you see is a society with really no rich and no poor. So, again, not only are the gender relationships more equal, but the relationships between everybody are more equal because there's little social distinction, right? There is no one who has more than another and therefore is ranked higher than them per se. Now, culturally, thanks to our hunter gatherer lifestyle, there is a lot of downtime. Okay. Um, Gathering does not require massive amounts of labor the way that agriculture does. So, in this free leisure time, you start to see the developments of very basic cultural beginnings. Okay. Artistically, Most expression is either visual or oral or performance based because, again, we have not quite gotten to written language yet. This manifests itself in stone painting, stone sculpture, oral traditions, stories, songs that are passed down generation to generation. Now, most of this depicts daily life, but that's to be expected. Another very early cultural beginning that you see among these Paleolithic humans is the beginnings of a ritual, what we would call spiritual life. Now, this is not going to be any organized religion that any of us would recognize. You're not going to see a holy book. You're not going to see holy men like priests or rabbis or imams. You're not going to see organization of religion, churches, synagogues, these types of things. But you do see the beginnings of belief systems. Most of them are what we call shamanistic, meaning that they relate to the spirit world. You have the veneration of earth spirits. You have the veneration of ancestors and their worship. The concept of a earth mother starts to develop in this, early spiritual world. Also, women are revered very highly spiritually, again, because they play such a crucial role in procreation. You can see evidence of this pretty much worldwide. These Venus figures that are on your screen right now are all early Paleolithic sculpture. They are all feminine figures with overly enlarged breasts, overly enlarged hips, overly enlarged buttocks, um, usually signifying, fertility, the ability to, again, procreate. And so women's crucial role in that process of procreation, again, makes them a very important part of this early spiritual life. Now, moving out of the social and the cultural, there is not much to speak of in terms of economic or political interactions. You do have some very early local exchange networks, and I mean, we do mean local here, measured in tens of miles. But again, that's what's to be expected when you take into account the lifestyle, okay? These are nomadic peoples, they are hunter gatherers. There is not going to be a lot of surplus to be traded. Um, Now, the early networks that do exist, although goods aren't necessarily moving across them in large numbers, ideas are, especially technology, projectile technology, boating technology, fishing technology, is diffused and spread along these very early trade routes. But again, it's very slowly. These are not bustling cities that we're talking about here. In terms of the political structure here, you tend not to see one. Government tends to require a lot of writing. Laws need to be written down, judgments need to be written down, taxes need to be collected and written down. So, what you see in these early kinship groups, because of the lack of writing, is that leadership is pretty fluid. It's generally based on skill, on experience, on strongest, fastest, jumping the highest. And it's also task driven. If the group is putting together a group to go for a hunt, the strongest, the fastest, the most experienced hunters are going to be the leaders of that task. Now, if the task is switched to gathering or building a structure or a shelter, well, then the people who are most skilled and most experienced in those areas are going to take on the leadership mantle. So you don't have any permanent political structure that we would recognize as, this person is a leader and over all other people, right? Now, what changes? Because even though we were this way for 96% of our history, We don't stay this way forever. So, what pushes us out of this Paleolithic lifestyle? The number one factor leading to this is around 20 to 15,000 years ago, the last ice age comes to an end. The planet starts to warm, sea levels begin to rise. And what this does is this melting of the large ice shelves on the northern and southern pole puts more water into the atmosphere and into the water cycle. We all know water is pretty much the equivalent of life. And as that water goes into the environment, there is a massive explosion of flora and fauna worldwide. So, with more plants, with larger herds of animals now available, we have greater access to food sources, which means that we have to move less and less as time goes on in order to attain the necessary food to keep ourselves alive. So these small kinship groups begin to settle in more permanent locations. And as they do that, they begin to grow in size. Our population starts to increase. Being in a permanent spot allows for the storage of surplus goods. So you start to see the accumulation of wealth now. Also, since there are now surplus goods and since we now have somewhere to store them, now trade becomes a truly viable activity. Exchange networks, trade networks begin to expand. And as they expand and as they get busier, cultural and technical diffusion begins to spread at a more rapid rate. So you have more diversity, more sharing of ideas. Now, coming soon on the horizon, we will eventually reach a point where that hunter-gatherer lifestyle can no longer support the growth in population that we have seen thanks to the end of the last ice age. So some solution will have to be found, and that solution is going to be agriculture. So that's the end of Unit 1. I will see you again for Unit 2 when we talk about the agricultural revolution. Hopefully you have been taking notes.